Revelation chapter 8. We're getting through the book here. We're making some progress. Last time when we talked through Revelation chapter 7, I told you that each chapter gets more and more difficult as you go through the book. Well, as we get into chapter 8, actually we get a little bit of a reprieve from that. So I think you'll find this chapter not quite as taxing, not quite as challenging, in large part because we've seen what we're going to see here. We've seen it before. Remember, as we get into this chapter, that we said that Revelation should not be read in a linear fashion from chapter 1 to chapter 22, as if it's going through history all the way through from chapter 1 to chapter 22, but it should be read in a cyclical fashion, that we're seeing the same history over and over and over again from different angles. Think of it this way. We have four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Suppose you were to read from Matthew chapter 1 to the end of the Gospel of John, and read it in a linear fashion as if it was going through history. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were going through history sequentially. Well, if you did that, Jesus would die 4 times and be raised to life 4 different times. But if you understand that each of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are telling us the same story about Jesus from a different perspective, adding this here, subtracting this over here, but really we're hearing the same thing over and over again, and only one death of Jesus, only one resurrection of Jesus told from 4 different perspectives, everything falls into place. It's easy for us to do that because it's 4 different books. In the book of Revelation, it's one book, but you have the same concept going on. We're seeing the same things happen again and again from different perspectives. Hope that makes sense. I hope that helps you understand that. And how do we know that that's the case? Well, as we said in the introductory video explaining these different principles of interpretation, as you go through the book of Revelation, you see the world end multiple times. Well, either there's multiple endings of the world, or the world only ends once, and we see it from different perspectives. The rest of Scripture tells us clearly the world only ends once. So therefore, Revelation cannot contradict that. Therefore, we must read Revelation in a cyclical fashion. And you'll see how that plays out here as we get into chapter 8. So chapter 8 is the third vision of Revelation. The vision encompasses chapters 8 through 11. This particular chapter, we get right into it with the first 4 trumpets. We've just gotten out of the 7 seals vision. We'll see the end of that here at 8 verse 1. But we've gotten through the 7 seals. Now we're going to go through the 7 trumpets. You see, we're seeing the same thing over again that we just saw from a little bit different perspective. The 4 trumpets are in chapter 8. These are going to sound a little bit familiar, and yet with a little nuance and a little twist. So let's get into the chapter. Let's actually read chapter 8, and then we'll dive in. When he opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and the 7 trumpets were given to them. Another angel who had a golden censer came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense to offer, with the prayers of all God's people on the golden altar in front of the throne. The smoke of the incense, together with the prayers of God's people, went up before God from the angel's hand. Then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and hurled it on the earth. And there came peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. Then the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to sound them. The first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled down on the earth. A third of the earth was burned up, a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. The second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain all ablaze was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea turned into blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. The third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. The fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them turned dark. A third of the day was without light, and also a third of the night. As I watched, I heard an eagle that was flying in midair, call out in a loud voice, woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because of the trumpet blasts about to be sounded by the other three angels. Revelation chapter 8. So some pretty significant things happening there. And we want to go through that chapter and give a look at some of those things. They should have sounded somewhat familiar. Did they kind of remind you of the four horsemen of the apocalypse a little bit? You saw the number 1/3 there. Did that kind of remind you of the number 1/4 that we saw in the previous vision? So we're seeing these same things happen. Let's go take a look at what we're seeing, shall we? Let's go back to verse 1 of chapter 8. So the first thing you have is the seventh seal is opened. This should really be part of chapter 7. And there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. There's these, we've talked about them before, these pregnant pauses. What's coming next? And then we find out what comes next. And it's kind of just part of apocalyptic literature, how that works with apocalyptic literature. But you have these seven angels and the seven trumpets given to them, and another angel, and all the prayers of God's people are right there at the throne of God. Again, words of comfort, right, to the people of God, wondering, are my prayers being heard? This persecution goes on and on and on. My troubles go on and on and on. Where's God? Is he listening? Oh no, the prayers are right there at the altar of God. What a comfort. The angel takes the censer, fills it with fire, hurls it to the earth. And in verse 5, again, I should probably stop reminding you to count, but I'll do it here. There came peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake, right? 4 things. In other words, the earth is about to get it. Things are about to go bad on the earth. And have we seen that, haven't we, throughout history? Things going bad on the earth. So the first angel sounds his trumpet. And what happens with that trumpet? Well, the earth, that is the physical land, is affected, is tormented in a sense by this trumpet that is blown. And so we see that there. Now, here's the third that we meet here for the first time. The third of the earth burned up, a third of the trees. And again, this reflects off the previous vision where there was a fourth. We talked about back then that this would be, we'd see the same thing happen again, but a little bit louder and a little bit worse. So that's kind of what we have going here. We shouldn't, again, to get the intended sense of the author, we're not supposed to go count the number of trees on the earth, divide by 3, and say 1/3 of them at some point in the future will be wiped out. That's not the point. What the author is saying, the intended sense of the author, is things are going to be really bad on the earth. God's creation is going to get really messed up. And the second angel sounds his trumpet, and and a huge mountain, something like a mountain, is thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea turns to blood, and a third of the living creatures in the sea die, and a third of the ships are destroyed. Again, we shouldn't say, oh, let's look into the future. Let's count the number of ships. I wonder, do we have to count boats and ships, or just ships? What does the word really mean? No, that's all a mistaken view of Revelation. That's not the intended sense of the author. The intended sense of the author is to tell us that the oceans, the salt water bodies will be in turmoil. Things will be a mess there too. So we have the earth a mess, the land mass is a mess. We have the oceans, the salt water a mess. The third angel sounds his trumpet, and then the springs, the fresh water is all affected as well. The fresh water turns bitter, and many people die from the waters that have become bitter. Again, we shouldn't be looking for a particular time in history when some river turned bitter and people drank from it and died. Does that happen? Sure, but that's not what's being talked about here. The point is the landmass, the salt water, the fresh water, everything is just suffering. What does the scripture say? That all creation groans, waiting for God's redemption under the penalty of humanity's sin. Then the fourth angel sounds his trumpet, and a third of the sun, the moon, the stars were all struck. A third of the day was without light, and also a third of the night. Again, this is picture language, all right? So think about what's being said here. A third of the night without light? Well, all of the night is without light, not just a third of the night, all right? So again, it's a picture. He's drawing a picture to say the earth is affected, the oceans and the salt water are affected, The fresh waters affected, the rivers, the streams, and also the heavens are affected. All of creation is affected by sin and is just going to go through incredible turmoil as the days, weeks, months, years progress. Then at the end of verse 13, we find out, whoa, 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 there's 3 more trumpets, and these trumpets are going to affect humanity. And so that's going to become very personal. As we get into those next chapters, it's going to affect us, that we're going to suffer as well. Because of the effects of sin on the whole universe, we too will suffer. Again, sounds very, very dramatic. It is very dramatic. It's very troubling. And yet to know that this is all part of the plan of God to work toward redemption, to bring comfort to us in the midst of all this, to know that God is still in charge. So that's an important point here to make, that God is still in charge, that he's going to be protecting us, caring for us in the midst of this. So again, a reminder that this chapter is really recapping the same kinds of things we saw in Revelation chapter 6. It's a cyclical book. We read it cyclically, and we're really going over some of the same things that we saw before. All right, one additional note as we close. This, you'll notice if you read back through chapter 8, that some of the images here come out of the book of Exodus. Again, we've talked about this before. The Old Testament is a huge resource. God wrote the Old Testament, right? God's writing and sharing with John these visions. So it's all a God thing. So Exodus and the 10 plagues become a great image, provide great images here for what John is seeing in terms of, if you remember, for instance, the Nile turns to blood as one of the 10 plagues. We see kind of that image here in the book of Revelation. We're going to see this Exodus imagery come out even more as we get into chapter 9. So that's what we got for chapter 8. Encourage you again to go back over this, although this was a little bit easier chapter, certainly easier than chapter 7 in terms of some of the complex concepts there. But go over chapter 8, make sure you understand it. You can explain it to someone else in your small group, or at least explain it to yourself before you head into chapter 9, and we'll get back together again for chapter 9.